Lord, fill our minds with knowledge of what we are and whose we are. Fill our bodies with the memory of a perfection which we have not yet attained, but which your Son prefigured in his bodily resurrection. And give our hearts a longing for the consummation of hope in your eternal kingdom at the wedding feast. For the sake of your Son, who allowed his body to be broken, that ours may be restored. Amen. All right, here I am to talk to you about sex again. I have the sense that the priests are going to keep sending me back to talk to you about sex until I get it right, which means I'll be back again next year, and annually thereafter, until I'm not able to do it anymore. What we're talking about is, today, what has gone wrong with love and how can we fix it? What's gone wrong with love and how can we fix it? Now, over the last several weeks, from Blessed John Paul II's Theology, the Body, and more particularly from the summary, short version of it for beginners, written by Christopher West, we've learned from Father Andrew, from Father Morgan, from Father Will, and myself, we've learned that we were made for love, and we are fulfilled by love, but that our loves are disordered. And so we are constantly disappointed and unfulfilled after the fall. And this is in part, we've learned, because we don't know what love is. We've forgotten what love is. And that, in turn, is because we do not know what it means to be a human being. We've forgotten who we are. So, who are we? The most important lesson, if you get nothing else out of this series, is that we are not beings who happen to inhabit our bodies the way that you inhabited or occupied your automobile on the way here this morning. We are our bodies. We are rational animals, embodied beings who understand and communicate and choose and act in bodily actions. God made our bodies as male and female, and he declared our embodied nature very good. In fact, he created us in his image to bear his likeness in the sense that we would exercise dominion over the present, over the time and space in which we live, the way that he exercises it over all eternity. And so the ancient Greeks actually created better than they knew when they depicted their gods and goddesses as embodied beings. Because we know from special revelation that God has created us to rule with him. It's such a powerful exercise of dominion that even the angels marvel at what that might be like to be us in our resurrected bodies in the eternal kingdom. So he created us to rule, exercise dominion over the earth, which begins with stewardship of his creation but doesn't end there. He created us to act as he acts, to create radically in the world new goods, new states of affairs, new technologies and novels and symphonies, and most awesome of all, new divine image bearers, to participate with him in the generation of new human life. He created us to do these things as man and woman. Not interchangeable beings, but complementary beings. And he created us to find beauty in our complementarity. So we get that thrown in as well. So Venus on the left there and Eros on the right, they are not dangerous and mysterious threats to our human health. They are, in fact, guides built into our human nature that can lead us to holiness and ultimate happiness. If we are open to the self-giving love for which God created us, then we will find true fulfillment. That's the promise of Mark 10 and Ephesians 5 and other scriptures. Lasting happiness in holiness. Ephesians 5, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, one flesh, two persons in one flesh, each person nourishing the other, forgetting their own appetites and desires, focused on nourishing the other, and then finding, because they are in fact one flesh, that by nourishing the other, they are nourishing themselves and finding fulfillment. That's the picture in Ephesians 5, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. But here's the problem. It is possible to turn Venus and Eros into gods, to seek them for their own sake. In fact, many people have done that, exactly that, throughout history. And when turned into gods, Venus and Eros prove elusive, always just outside our grasp. Maybe momentary satisfactions come our way from time to time, but in the long term, over the course of our lives, we never attain what we're seeking. And ultimately, turning them into gods destroys our ability to love as we are designed to love. So that's the problem. That's what we're trying to deal with. Now, the proper end of Venus is to find her perfection in Eros. And Venus and Eros together lead us to holiness. But if pursued by herself and for her own sake, Venus might occasionally provide fleeting satisfaction, as we said, but she'll always slip from our grasp. She'll always elude our pursuit. And the reason is she's not meant to be held alone. She is meant to lead us to her king, Eros, who is meant to lead us to his king, who is the Logos of the universe, whose order we embody in the real world. So we need to begin today by understanding Venus better. And right off the bat, I want to take 2 facts about Venus as given. We're just going to stipulate these facts. These are not controversial facts. They're just facts. So it's just better to stipulate them at the outset. But some people, we must confess, find them to be embarrassing. So if I embarrass you over the next 5 minutes, I'm not even sorry about it. But it's not my fault. The first fact, 2 facts about Venus. The first fact is that she can be intensely pleasurable. Just a fact, right? She can be intensely pleasurable. Venus is a very sensual goddess. And of course, this can lead us astray. Because when we focus on the pleasure itself, rather than the person in whom we find the pleasure, Venus is not leading us into love. She's leading us into lust. Our focus in that moment is on our own bodies, my own body. The lover's body is a mere instrument, a tool for my satisfaction. That's not love. That is making another human being an object and failing to treat that human being as a moral agent created in God's image in her own right. By contrast, when we focus on the person of the beloved and give ourselves entirely to the beloved, we find pleasure added in as part of the fulfillment of Eros. Seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added to you. The fulfillment in Eros is that love in which we find fulfillment by forgetting ourselves and desiring the good of the beloved. C.S. Lewis describes this difference very well in his book, The Four Loves, which we've already referenced. I quote, "Without Eros, sexual desire, like every other desire, is a fact about ourselves. Within Eros, it is rather about the beloved. It becomes almost a mode of perception, entirely a mode of expression. It feels objective, something outside us in the real world. That is why Eros, though the king of pleasures, always at his height, has the air of regarding pleasure as a byproduct. To think about it would plunge us back in ourselves, in our own nervous system. It would actually kill Eros, Lewis says. Anyway, he asks, whose pleasure? For one of the first things Eros does is to obliterate the distinction between giving and receiving. One flesh. By giving, I am also receiving. The second fact about Venus, is this. She's hilarious. This, Lewis says, is why there are so many jokes about sex. Or to put it a little more completely, Venus plays games with us. It is up to us how we respond to those games. We can find her either hilarious or endlessly frustrating. Better to laugh than to grow resentful. Yeah? So here's Lewis. Venus is a mocking, mischievous spirit, far more elf than deity, and makes games of us. When all external circumstances are fittest for her service, she will leave one or both the lovers totally indisposed for it. When every overt act is impossible and even glances cannot be exchanged, in trains, in shops, and in interminable parties, she will assail them with all her force. An hour later, when time and place agree, she will have mysteriously withdrawn, perhaps from only one of them. What a pother this must arise, what resentment, self-pity, suspicions in those who have deified her. But sensible lovers laugh. It is all part of a game of catch as catch can. In short, we should not fear Venus. We should not vest in her too much power or expect too much of her. We live after the fall, after all, so Venus is, in fact, a faithless servant. We can be grateful that she ever shows up at all, otherwise none of us would have ever been born. The next problem is that eros can only work on a whole person, a person who desires another whole person. Eros does not work on mere bodies, and he does not work on mere spirits. He works on human beings, and as we keep emphasizing, human beings are embodied souls. The world around us teaches falsehoods about human nature. Specifically, our cultural elites today are fascinated with this dualism, which teaches that the real you is a spiritual you, which happens to inhabit this crude bodily external shell. They teach you that the real person is located within the body and occupies it. So let me just give you two examples of this ripped from recent headlines. Here's the first one. In the spirit of Whitney, Houston hologram tour set to begin. I'll just read a few lines from the story from the Associated Press. Whitney Houston is about to appear on the concert stage again. 8 years after her death, a holographic Houston will embark on a European tour that starts in England on February 25 and runs through early April, with U.S. dates expected to follow. Last week, a few dozen members of the media were given a dress-rehearsed preview in Burbank, California, of an evening with Whitney, the Whitney Houston hologram tour. Think about that for a second. An evening with Whitney, which features a Houston projected onto a nearly invisible scrim on a stage with real dancers and a live backing band. The concert set includes most of her biggest hits. How Will I Know? Saving All My Love for You. I Will Always Love You. Along with some unexpected rarities, including a cover of Steve Winwood's Higher Love. Could there be a more perfect expression of the great fallacy of our age than this? Artificial intelligence and sophisticated projection technologies are used to create the illusion of a sultry celebrity singing about a higher love that goes on forever, even though that celebrity's body is turning into dust somewhere else. And people are going to go pay to go see this illusion and participate in it and be sucked into it. Why? Why are they going to give up hours of their lives and good money that they earned in the presence of the spirit of Whitney Houston, created entirely by technology, artificial, while her body returns to dust elsewhere? What are they seeking at that concert? What desire has been twisted? Next, this is from The Guardian. This is a story about ghosting. Now, for those of you who don't spend much time around young people, to ghost someone is to become romantically and sexually involved with that person and then to disappear from their lives suddenly. As you can expect, as you can imagine, most of the time this is young men doing it to young women. It involves first a high degree of emotional and physical intimacy, And then next, cutting all communication off and ignoring the other person's texts and phone calls. So here's the story from The Guardian: ghosting, caspering, and 6 new dating terms you've never heard of. Pay close attention. I quote, "In an age of dating apps and receipts and socially acceptable stalking, a whole new confusing lingo has emerged. Most people are familiar with terms like ghosting, when you casually ignore someone's existence in messages. But what about ghost busting, when you force them to reply? Or the Dickensian Marleying, when an ex gets in touch with you at Christmas out of nowhere? Caspering is the newest addition to the modern dating lexicon. Named after the fictional child phantom, it's a friendly alternative to ghosting. Instead of ignoring someone, you're honest about how you feel, and then you let them down gently before disappearing from their lives." Sexting the waters. This is when someone obviously wants to sext you, but they're scared about being too direct and getting rebuffed. It goes downhill from there. If you're wondering what it's like to be a single young person trying to find love in the digital age, I encourage you to go look up these terms online. I know you're not too easily shocked. And it will tell you everything you need to know about what they're going through. They have bought the lie. They are functional Platonic dualists. They really believe that the real self and the body are 2 different things. So they wrongly believe that they can join their bodies together without joining themselves. And then when the other person's body disappears from their lives, they're surprised to discover that they're haunted by the continued presence of the other person's spirit, even as they're pained by the absence of the other person's body. That takes them by surprise. No one ever told our young people that sex is permanent. You see? No one ever told them who they are, that they are embodied beings, and that when they join their bodies to another person, they're joining themselves to that person. No one explained the generative telos of sexual organs. No one ever taught them that for a man to enter into a woman is for each to become part of the other in a union that is supposed to be self-giving, life-giving, total, and if a child results, eternal. For a child, of course, is just a human being, and a human being is just an eternal being. And not even abortifacient drugs can change that. Now, as John Paul II taught, and as Christopher West has been emphasizing throughout our series, sexual intercourse just is the words of a wedding vow embodied, made flesh. As West puts it, sexual union is where husband and wife are meant to incarnate divine love. Now again, it bears emphasis, as we've repeatedly said, that a real marriage, a lifelong union of a man and a woman, is good in itself, whether or not a couple has children, whether or not the couple are Christians, whether or not they acknowledge the existence of God, or that the gift of sex comes from Him, or even whether or not they come to realize eros together. All of those things can happen within a real marriage, but the marriage remains good even if they never develop that loving feeling, or if they've lost it. And it bears emphasis that 2 college kids who hook up for a one-night stand and never communicate again are not married in that comprehensive sense, because they've not intended the union that they in fact form. Right? We are rational embodied creatures. Marriage is the union of both body and mind. But they have performed a marital act. We need to see that they have performed as a marital act, and they've joined together 2 bodily organs that by their nature are designed to join permanently. So to have sex with someone and then be ghosted by them is to suffer a kind of amputation. So we have young people walking around emotionally and physically maimed. Our young people are surprised to discover they're wounded because no one ever told them this truth. What is the truth? It's the one we've been emphasizing throughout, that this is the point of sex. Physical desire is to lead us into a desire for the beloved herself. Venus leads to eros. The bridegroom is then the objective, who then leads us into holiness, completeness of the whole person. The consummation of that desire in marital sex is, of course, a kind of death to a kind of self. But it's a death to self in which we find a new life, the satisfaction of a much greater desire that we didn't even know we had until it was awakened in marriage. And only that desire can be satisfied permanently, in a way that mere sexual desire can never be satisfied for more than a moment. And then we discover, sometimes to our surprise, that we found both happiness and holiness. Along the way, we might get children, poetry, love songs, and other glimpses of divine beauty, all thrown in. Now, I think we failed to teach this to our young people because most of us never learned the truth ourselves. Like many of you, I was very badly catechized about sex growing up. Now, most people today are taught one of two things: either a puritanical self-denial or a licentious hedonism. I got both. I grew up in a hyper-legalistic fundamentalist home in hyper-secular New England, the heartland of Darwinian materialism. So I got legalism at home and hedonism everywhere else I went. And that disordered my desires. But fortunately, I also had a guy named Stephen Curtis Chapman. Stephen Curtis Chapman has no idea who I am, but he catechized me correctly in sex. Believe it or not, there was a brief moment in the 1990s when contemporary Christian music was actually pretty creative, before it turned into the insipid, milquetoast, disembodied, positive and encouraging twaddle that it is now. And I was extremely fortunate to come of age during that brief moment in time. It was Chapman's 1992 album, The Great Adventure, that gave me my first glimpse beyond Venus toward Eros. And fortunately, the album dropped my junior year of high school, just when my testosterone was raging. And listening to that album seeped into my soul. No one has ever painted a more aching word picture of marital love, for example, than these lines from Chapman's song, Go There With You. I will take a heart whose nature is to beat for me alone and fill it up with you, make all your joy and pain my own. Now, 17-year-old me didn't understand what that meant. But I sensed that a love that mingles two people's entire lives must be more fulfilling than a love that momentarily combines their bodies. I wasn't mature enough to want that yet, but I wanted to want it. Then there's Chapman's beautiful song about feminine longing, Maria. Maria is too young to understand that her heart is hardening because she lives in an angry place where no love can grow. And yet she still longs for love. She aches for someone to touch her body with the tenderness she longs for, like a desert longs for rain. And I discovered that I wanted to satisfy that longing for some woman someday. Best of all was Chapman's song, Paradise. The song begins with a story about Jimmy and Mary, who met and married in 6 weeks' time, raised 4 kids, and have now been married for 60 years. Mary now lives in a nursing home, and Jimmy drives across town to see her every morning at 8 a.m. And they spend their days reading about the promised land. Jimmy and Mary have given their lives to each other. They literally belong to each other. And they know that the best is yet to come. And that, Chapman sings, is paradise. I think we should get a license to play Stephen Curtis Chapman's album on every high school and college campus in Montgomery on continual loop. Even better, I was catechized by actual married couples that I knew. Because my family was poor, and probably to keep my brothers and me out of trouble, my father had us work during our school breaks on a local farm, usually 60 to 80 hours a week. So I spent 10 years working on that farm from age 13 to 22. And because we were often working such long hours, I often spent many nights staying with the family, living amongst these 3 generations of Christians who lived out Ephesians 5 in front of me. And it was formative for me. It ordered my loves toward the good. I also have you. Now, I know that many of you have never read Thomas Aquinas or John Paul II, and you might not have worked out a defense of marriage which would satisfy a theological ethicist or an analytical philosopher. But you love and obey Jesus. And so your lives, many of you, proclaim the truth about human nature, about marriage, and about the power of eros. And I've learned much from living among you for the last 13 years. So the good news is, we can catechize, because we are embodied beings, we can catechize by our actions. We ought to teach truth with our words, but we can also teach by our actions. All of us, single, married, divorced, widowed, can teach by living well the teachings of Ephesians 5, whatever our calling, whether to celibacy or marriage. We catechize by our actions. Remember, the passage about husband and wife in Ephesians 5 is just one part, right? It's in the middle. But it's in the middle of a chapter about the life of the church, self-giving love by all within the church, where everyone is nourishing the others and finds himself nourished. Now, don't take my word for it. Ask pop music superstar Justin Bieber. You might think him an ironic teacher on this point, but the young celebrity came from a broken home. Fame and success did not improve his character. He had several infamous encounters with the law and substance abuse before he's reportedly turned his life around in recent months. And he was asked about it in a recent interview. Bieber is reported to have said that the crucial moment for him was realizing, pay attention to this, that obedience to Jesus means turning away from sin. No one had ever explained that to him before. And what motivated his obedience? And here I'm going to quote. This is Bieber. "I'm very, very grateful to have influences in my life that have played a huge part in me seeing their relationship with Jesus and their relationship with their wives and their relationship with their kids and saying, that's what I want." Bieber told the interviewer that had he not come to that realization, he would not be alive today. So live Ephesians 5, because you might save somebody's life. Now, the point of JP2's Theology of the Body is that the sex life of a Christian is not for the Christian. It's for other people. You see. But in living for others, we find that ultimate fulfillment. Good sex is not a matter of suppressing our desires. It is instead a matter of awakening to the greater desire that alone can be ultimately satisfied. And true, that requires that we die to our lesser selfish desires. But they can't be satisfied for more than a moment anyway. So we're not really giving up very much to gain the kingdom of eternal bliss. I think this bears emphasis because the bad catechesis that we received led us to two opposing errors. Some of us came to believe that sex is for physical pleasure and no more, and that we can use our bodies any way we want without destroying our nature. That is a lie. Others of us came to believe that God is a tyrant, that his will is that we must deny our nature, suppress our longings. That is also a lie. Some of us incoherently came to believe both lies simultaneously. Because ultimately they converge on the same point. Madison Avenue and Silicon Valley on one hand, and many of the pastors standing in our pulpits on Sunday morning on the other, all seem to agree that God's will is morally arbitrary and contrary to our natural longings. Lies. All lies. False, false, false. Don't believe it. The point of a Christian sexual ethic is not to suppress our desire. It is instead to awaken a correct ordering of our desires, which alone can be ultimately fulfilled. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church opens its teaching on the Christian life with these words. Christian, recognize your dignity, and now that you share in God's own nature, do not return to your former base condition by sinning. Remember who is your head and of whose body you are a member. Never forget that you have been rescued from the power of darkness and brought into the light of kingdom of heaven. Now, our own Anglican catechism emphasizes obedience to God's will, at least as much as the goodness of God's design. And that leads some Anglicans, I think mistakenly, to a voluntarist ethic, that ethic that what matters is not the good that God wills for us, but just that he wills it. His will is perfect and inscrutable. We're depraved and unable to understand his ways. The problem is this makes God seem arbitrary. We're supposed to obey God because he's God and we're not. And that is that. But I think that's a mistaken reading. The whole catechism leads up to the work of sanctification. And the end of the catechism, the very last paragraph of the very last page of the entire book, says this. What marks a life of sanctification? God calls me to a life marked by gratitude and joy. In gratitude for God's grace in Jesus, I die daily to the desires of my fallen nature. In the joy of knowing that I will become like Jesus, I live each day in service to him. So what does that mean, to live in service to Jesus? It means that we get life. He said, I come that you may have life and have it abundantly. That same Jesus talked explicitly about sexual intercourse as the basis of the nuclear family, which God designed for our enjoyment and our good. Jesus explained that God designed us male and female so that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave, literally enter into the body of his wife. And their two fleshes will become one flesh. And this is how we participate in God's generation of new human lives. And it is how we come to that full, abundant life known as holiness. That is why marriage is monogamous. One man enters one woman, and so they are completed. It is also why it is permanent. To rend asunder the one flesh is to destroy what we are created for. It is to amputate. And it is why it is conjugal. Only a man and a woman can complete each other in this way. And it is why sexual union must be open to the generation of new life, which is the end toward which it is naturally oriented and the manifestation of union itself in the world. So the prohibitions of the Christian sexual ethic are not morally arbitrary. They direct us toward the good. Any other use of our sexual powers is sin, which is to say death. So God's commands are not arbitrary. He commands us not to fornicate or divorce or commit adultery or engage in same-sex intimacy because he wants us to be happy forever, not just for a moment. None of these features of marriage is well understood today, and all of them are controversial because we've forgotten what a human being is, and so we find that true marriage seems odd and counterintuitive to us. But I think perhaps least well understood, particularly to us Protestants, is the last one. West spends several pages on it because John Paul II did. And I think it behooves us to understand the Roman Catholic teaching about openness to procreation, even if we don't ultimately find it persuasive, because we need to see that it's not arbitrary. It points toward a beautiful aspect of marital union that many Protestant churches have missed over the last century or so. Briefly, the Catholic Church teaches that sexual union constitutes the reciprocal giving of self to the other, which creates the union, instantiates, constitutes, brings about the union. That's what marital union is, a complete giving of oneself. This entails that any holding back of oneself is to break the union. It is to make sex something other than marital union. It is to, therefore, use the other person as a mere instrument for sexual gratification. It is to lust rather than to love. Now, there are different ways to hold back. Again, precisely because we are embodied rational beings, we can hold back either with our minds or with our bodies. One can hold back one's intentions in one's mind in various ways, which the church has condemned as sinful throughout the centuries. For example, thinking of another person while having sex with your spouse. The church has taught that's a sin. You're holding back part of yourself. Or by having sex with someone without a commitment of permanence. One can also, the church teaches, hold back the body while giving of self. And this is what contraception does according to the Roman Catholic Church. Contraception breaks the union as a marital act and as a sacrament. As a marital act, sexual union is inherently oriented toward procreation. It's that capacity for procreation that is what makes the union a union, and not mere rubbing together. So on this view, contraception converts love into lust. As a sacrament, marital union constitutes in the world God's life-giving love. It is a participation in his generation of new life and a sign of his redemption of the world. And this can happen only if the act accurately signifies God's love. The language of the body communicates that God is life-giving love. And as West puts it, to use contraception is to communicate with one's body that God is not life-giving love. So that's the account, that's the picture. Now, whatever you think of it, it's not arbitrary. So the Anglican Church does not teach that the injunction against contraception is a moral absolute. We don't go as far as the Catholics do here. But I think we should recognize that in this teaching, there's an important reflection of the truth about our nature. That whether or not we view this as a moral absolute, we have strong reasons at least to be open to the generation of children. The bottom line here is that we have strong reasons to live as though sex is self-giving. And we often fail to live that way. We all sin differently, but we all sin. And that is why we come here. We come here to repent, to relearn the truth that our bodies proclaim, that we are embodied, rational beings in God's image, male and female. And then we receive the body of Christ, broken for us, his blood spilled for us. And then we go out to bring life and light to the world. Amen? All right, we have 10 minutes for questions. Who wants to go first? There's a moratorium on Doug asking the first question. Just kidding. No one found that controversial? I was trying my best. Surely someone has some questions.
Well, I think one thing is a lot of us grew up in that age where a lot of us grew up.
What? They're recording.
A lot of us grew up in an age where our parents, just as you were speaking, sex was taboo. Obviously, it should have been, but the way it was formulated as we were growing up has created, as you have mentioned, a lot of confusion for our generation.
Yeah.
I found it interesting when you taught about Eros and Venus. When my husband did counseling, he was a preacher, he would talk about how the man would become like Christ and die for the church, which was like his wife. So he had some element of what you were saying in there. And then he would say, you don't give 50% and 50%, you give 100% and 100% to each one. So it's very similar, but very simple language, where it's yours is so philosophical, it might be difficult for the 20.
Too fancy. Well, I want to disagree with the last point, though I want to agree with everything that comes before it. So, so that's the picture in Ephesians 5, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, isn't it? This idea that there's a radical equality of Adam and Eve, radical equality of husband and wife, man and woman, in that they are both created in God's image. They're both rational animals. They both have moral agency. They both have this radical capacity to generate new good states of affairs in moment, the way that God does over all eternity. So there's a radical ground of our equality. This is the basis of equal rights, for example. But there's a radical difference between them, isn't there? That the radical equality is a complementary equality in this sense, that the mission of the husband is to sacrifice his own desires to serve the wife. It is a kind of death. It's not as dramatic as climbing up on a cross. It's as mundane as fixing her coffee first, or letting her sleep in on Saturday mornings, or whatever, right? But that's a death to self. Small deaths to self through which the husband demonstrates his love for her. And what's her job? It's to submit to that mission. Right? So the idea that the wife is supposed to submit, period, that was the idea that was used and abused for many decades and centuries. She's supposed to submit to his mission. And what's his mission? To die for her. Her job is just to let him die for her. That's what she was made for. Yeah? So this is the picture. This is the picture, is that in this self... And then what's the result? The result is a union in which the two persons become one flesh in this way that somehow mysteriously reflects the self-giving love of the Trinity, two persons in one being, and ultimately reflects the union of Christ and the church. Paul tells us in Ephesians 5. And that is a self-giving love in which we find full union and full fulfillment. That's the picture in Ephesians 5. We got it completely backwards, didn't we? We got it completely backwards. I don't think that young people are incapable. I think what's happened is, so there's a bigger story to tell about this, which I actually tell in my new book, about what's happened as a result of postmodernism. Postmodernism sometimes is referred to as intersectionality, the idea that our identity is found within ourselves. We each have our own identity, which we must sort of find and discover and express in the world, and then it has to be ratified by other people, and it's all tied up with this Platonic dualism. But this idea of postmodernism is that there is no truth. Everybody has their own truth. I have my truth, you have your truth. It's the kind of thing you hear on Oprah, right? Live your truth, right? That's postmodernism. That's intersectionality. That's the prevailing spirit of our age. It's very Gnostic. They've been captured by this Gnosticism. They have. But what I've discovered is they long for something more. They long to believe that they are capable of being called up into something other than themselves, beyond themselves, more fulfilling than themselves, because they know better. They know that they are not fulfilling themselves. They know that. And it's creating an existential angst among them, I have found. It's a tremendous amount of pressure to create your own identity ex nihilo. You should try it sometime. It's awful. Right? Just think in those terms. Think in those terms that my embodied nature doesn't determine my identity. My parents don't determine my identity. My maleness or my femaleness doesn't I get to choose, right? That my choices and actions don't determine my identity. That nothing about me determines my identity except my feelings. Awful, terrifying place to live. And our young people are living there. But the moment you give them a taste of something bigger and better and objective and out there in the world into which they can be called up, I find, not all of them, but many of them respond very, very well. They just soak it up. They soak it up. They're desperate for it.
And do you think that's why this younger generation, they are so much more focused on like social justice and doing for others, and it's that longing in them
Yes.
to be part of something bigger than just themselves? Because that's one thing they maybe misguided, but they do it really well. I mean, they have a real passion for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question for the recording is that one reason why young people are so caught up in the social justice movement? Yeah, I think so. The first thing to note about what they mean by social justice, the moment you press into it, is it's very much tied up in this Gnosticism. So social justice means affirming someone else's self-identity, which of course is not justice. That's to do them an injustice, right? So it's a falsehood. But the second thing to know about it is it's become a god for them. It has become a god for them in a way that Venus was, sorry baby boomers, for the baby boomers, right? Oh, wait, there she is, the goddess of Woodstock, right? This was the goddess of 1969, right? And young people today do not find her satisfying. They don't find her satisfying. This might surprise you. Many of them just aren't having sex. They know that they're created for something bigger and better and more important and more than themselves. They know that. And they want to be called up into something more important. Yeah. So let's tell them the truth with our words and our actions. Yes?
Adam, whenever you talk to young people and you tell them the truth, I have found that usually they're motivated by fear.
Yes.
They're very afraid, but have you ever gotten one after you've spoken the
Oh, yeah.
I've noticed in the younger generation, they will intentionally, on the ghosting and casting and this, with all the social media, they will intentionally involve themselves with someone 7 or 8 states away. And then, oh, well, neither of us can lose our way. They will intentionally make sure they're not involved with anyone where they could have a flourishing future. I've noticed that with several people I work with.
Absolutely. So,
And so they're not marrying, they're not having sex,
Yeah.
but it's out of fear.
Yeah.
I can tell it's because they're
I had a young man sitting in my office 2 weeks ago, tell me, very candid, in a moment of candor. Now, the moments of candor don't happen very often, but when they happen, they're really instructive. He used the word terrified about marriage. He said, I'm terrified to get married. I'm terrified by that prospect. So absolutely, they're driven by fear. There's a dramatic illustration of exactly the thing you're talking about. Getting involved in a way that doesn't require anything of me. So in 2012, those of you who are Alabama fans will remember, Alabama played my Notre Dame Fighting Irish in the national championship game. I will forgive you for it someday, but I'm not ready yet. And the middle linebacker for Notre Dame was a Heisman Trophy finalist, phenomenal athlete named Manti Te'o. Just weeks before the game, it was revealed that his girlfriend had died, and he was in grieving for his girlfriend. And then things started to get weird. And eventually the story came out that he had never actually met this girl. They had had a months-long romantic relationship virtually. And then when he started to become emotionally attached to this girl who didn't exist, the guys who had created this girl felt that they ought to reveal to him that she didn't exist, and so they killed her off. How does that happen, right? I mean, those of us who grew up before the digital age, we just say, well, how does that happen, right? But that's the world that they inhabit. Nothing is real. Nothing is real. A Whitney Houston hologram tour, well, of course, right? That's the real Whitney, right? That's the world they inhabit. It's a completely different view of the world. And it's false. It's just false. But we know the truth. So go proclaim the truth. And I'm going to have to let you go because we've got to relieve the child care workers. Thank you. Oh, Father Morgan has one comment. Yeah. This is going to be really important, so we're going to give him the microphone.
Well, this is our last, running out of this, so I'm just going to shout.
All right.
So this is our last class for the Theology of the Body series. I want to thank you all for being a part of this. I want to thank Adam, Father Will, Father Andrew for teaching so efficiently and on a topic that is very important. This is not designed to be a stop to these discussions. We want you to continue having discussions. This is just meant to whet your appetite for further exploration. A lot of you have pointed to the fact that we need to be talking about this, both amongst ourselves, but also with our kids. So I encourage you to continue to do that. Thank you for coming. Next week, we're going to start our Lenten series, which is going to be about Sabbath and prayer. So we're going to explore Sabbath together and then different methods of prayer. But thank you. Thank you for coming. And